Hi, I'm Nick Araz, and welcome to this series on creating an animated intro title in both Cinema 4D and After Effects. In this tutorial series, you will learn how to create, design, and animate a 3D extruded intro title within Cinema 4D. We'll then render that to After Effects for final compositing utilizing Maxon One tools such as Trapcode Particular, Magic Bullet, and Universe so that we can build the final look. Now, by the end of this series, you'll feel comfortable stylizing, animating, and extruding text. We'll become more familiar with the Cinema 4D sculpting tools to create damage on the letters, and we'll learn how to render image sequences to After Effects, and more about how After Effects and Red Giant can aid in your final creations. I can't wait for us to begin so that we can start to create and design the extruded text, so I'll see you in the next movie. In this movie, we're going to create and design some extruded text. We're then going to decorate it using a material, primarily with the reflectance channel, and then light it with a sky object. Now, to make sure that we're on the same page, let's take a look at our Cinema 4D project settings. If it's not showing for you in the Attributes Manager, head to the Edit menu and choose Project Settings. Here, we just want to make sure that linear workflow is enabled and checked, and that the input color profile is set to sRGB. This is to make sure that we have established a color management system between Cinema 4D and After Effects, which we'll be using later on. The next thing we want to check is our render settings. So I'm going to click on this button right here, and under our output options, let's click on this downward arrow to choose a film and video preset for HDTV 1080 2997. We also want to make sure that the frame range is beyond the current frame and set to all frames. Let's close out that window, and we're going to extend the length of our project, which is currently at 90 frames, to 220 by entering it here in this field. Let's also drag out this timeline bar so that we can see all the frames and access them within our project. Before extruding our text, let's create a text spline by heading to the spline menu and choosing text. Currently our text is left aligned, but we can change that in the Attributes Manager to middle. And let's type in this field here, lost, return, the and symbol, return, followed by found. Now you can click on a gray area in order to see your text. And if you head over to the View menu, click on Frame Geometry. You can also use your 1, 2, and 3 keys with your mouse in order to move around your text, along with that H key to frame your geometry. Now we want to have our text look a little bit better. First thing is let's choose a font. Under font options, there is one I've chosen from Adobe Fonts for this video, which is Mrs. Eves. You can download that with your Creative Cloud subscription. And if you don't have it, just choose a serif font of your choice. We'll also choose under the options of the font Roman lining, and bring down the vertical spacing by clicking and dragging on the arrows over here at the side. In order to have our text look a little bit nicer in terms of design, I'm going to show the 3D graphic user interface here for my text. And under cameras, change this to the front perspective, using my 1 key just to frame this a bit better. The first thing I want to do is work on the L, so I'll click the L to select it. And notice that I have separate horizontal and vertical scaling controls for my text. If I drag up, I can elongate that L to make it a little bit more stylistic. I'll repeat that with the T, dragging up there, and then actually making this a little bit wider as well. And then I'll repeat that step for the F, dragging up there, and a little bit here to the side, as well as on the D. Now I'll just check my text again and then fix up any kerning issues. So I notice there's a lot of space between the F and the O in found. So I'll select the O and just drag it over here to the left. I'll then go up and look at my lost text and then just drag the O a little bit to the right and the S also a little bit to the right. Feel free to play with this to taste. And once finished, head back to the camera options and choose Perspective View. Now that our text is nice and designed, it's time for us to extrude it. One way to do that is making sure it's selected in the Object Manager. Hold down the Option or Alt key when you head over the Extrude object and click it. With Option or Alt held down, the text will become a child of the extrude object. Now in the Attributes Manager, under Object, let's first of all bring down the offset to get rid of the Superman text and enter a value of 10. We'll head to the Caps tab, and right now both the Start and End cap are activated. What I like to do is have separate controls for each of them rather than control both of the bevels with the controls that are displayed right here. I'll click on that to activate it. And just under the Start bevel as well as the End bevel are your options to work with presets. I'll select this 4-step bevel and notice once zooming in on the text that has been applied to it. This is not what we're going for in this particular case, so under bevel shape I'm going to choose round. I'm going to make the size value a value of about 7 and then change the shape depth to be a value of -3. And this is the type of feel we're going for with our current text. It's now time to give our text a material. One way to do that is to double click here in the Material Manager. And I'm going to double click this default material again to load up the editor and have it nice and big. I'm going to deactivate the color and keep the reflectance channel activated. Now, in order to get a nice reflection, I'm actually going to remove the default specular that's applied. And under the Add options, I'm going to choose Beckman. Here, I'm going to decide on a roughness value of about 9. We're going to change the layer color to be more of a copper color. I've settled on the values of 38 degrees, 82%, and 66% for HSV. And I'll choose OK. Heading down to the Layer Fresnel options, I'll choose a Conductor Fresnel. And under Presets, there happens to be one specifically for copper. I'll bring down the brightness of the layer color to 80%. And now it's time for us to work in the bump channel. So let's activate that first. And under our texture options, I'm going to choose a layer, which allows us to mix various shaders together. I'm going to click here on that black box. And under the shader options, I want to choose to add a noise shader. To change the noise shader's values, I'm going to click on here and first of all come to the global scale, which I'll give it 65%, and choose a different type of noise rather than the default. I'll set this to POXO. Here's a different generated noise pattern, which I can continue to play around with these values, but let's also add another one to the mix. So I'm going to click on this backward left arrow to head back here inside my layer texture. And under these shader options, I'm going to add yet another noise shader. I'll head into that new noise shader, and from the noise dropdown, this time choose a Luca type of noise and bring down the global scale to a value of 45%. Heading back where I can see both noise shaders, I'll choose to mix them together by choosing a blend mode over here at the side. I'll set the noise shader on top to overlay, and then just bring down its opacity to 52%. Once finished, I will just head back where I can see the overall bump channel and the two current noise shaders that are being mixed together inside the layer. And I'm going to bring down the overall strength because 20% is way too much. I'm going to settle on a value of 6% for now so that the bump is rather subtle. I'm going to close out the material editor and I'm going to double click just to rename this material to copper, and I'll click and drag it, placing it on the extrude object. And you'll see here that my text gets generated. If you decide to try to render this by pressing Command R or clicking on this button, you may only see very little of it because we haven't lit it yet. Let's illuminate this text by bringing a sky object into the scene and giving it a material that will illuminate our text. To do that, I'm going to head over here and add a sky object to our scene. I'm now going to double click to add a new material. I'll call this HDR and I'll double click it again so we go into the material editor. I'm going to deactivate the color channel and also the reflectance. Right now, we just need the luminance channel. And what's great about this is that we can choose to load our own image here into the texture channel. We can even drag and drop elements from the content browser to use as a material that's going to illuminate our text. So I'm going to head over here to the content browser and I'm going to do a search for HDR and press the return key. Here I have it for HDR type textures as well as some HDR type materials, the ones that are wrapped around spheres. I'm going to choose to use this sunset texture and I'm just going to simply drag it here into the texture field, and you'll notice now that it's referencing that HDR from the content browser. Now I'm going to head back to the objects manager and now drag that HDR texture onto the sky object. This time, when I render out the scene, you can see that it's starting to illuminate the text, but this particular material that I chose happens to be a little bit dark, not getting some of the great reflections and bump from the material that we've added to the extruded object. In the material manager, I'll double click the HDR material we just created. I want to head back to the content browser, and this time I want to do a search for the word bridge. I just so happen to know that under here happens to be a bridge texture, which has a lot of contrast, which we can use to illuminate our scene. This time before this, I'm actually going to click down here and throw this into a filter. Now that the actual image is in a filter, we have options for performing some color correction, such as heading over to the saturation value and entering negative 100%. Now that that's set up, I could drag this new texture, this HDR texture, into that texture field. In a matter of seconds, it swaps it out. Because this HDR material is also already on my sky object, it's illuminated my scene quite nicely. I'll head back to the object manager and just render out the scene so you guys can see where it is, and move around the text so you can see how it looks. I'll press the H key just to frame my geometry to the scene. And while I want the sky object to help illuminate my text, I don't want to see it. So I'm going to right click on the sky object, and we are going to choose under render tags compositing. With the compositing tag selected under the attributes manager, we want to make sure that this is not going to be seen by the camera. And you'll notice that when I press Command R to now render the scene, we no longer see that sky object or the material that we added. Taking one final look at the text, we might want to perform a little bit of kerning before we finish. So I'll just head back to the text spline, and with the GUI still activated, drag the O closer to the F and the U closer to the O. Now that we've finished our steps of decorating the text, it's time to do a little bit of separation in preparation for the animation of these characters, along with a camera that we're going to add to the scene in the next movie. The first thing I'd like to do is separate lost and found from the and. First thing I'll do is duplicate my text by command clicking and dragging on the extrude object to make a copy of it. I'm going to temporarily just work on this above extrude object. So I will double click on the traffic lights of the extrude one copy in order to hide it. Here under the text spline of the first extruded object, I'm just going to select the and symbol and just press the space bar. The reason that I press the space bar to remove the and is because the kerning parameters use the letter position within the text, and if we delete a letter, we're changing which letter the parameter applies to. Now by replacing the letter with a space, we're retaining the number of letters. Now that we know this, I will activate the traffic lights for my extruded one copy text and head to the text spline here, where I'll remove the lost by pressing the spacebar and the found by pressing the spacebar. If I just double click on the traffic lights again, you can see my above text is lost found, and my below text is indeed the and symbol. Let's name those accordingly. And now that we're finished with the decoration of our text, now it's time to animate this as well as add a background before we send and finish off the compositing inside of it. In this movie, we're going to animate the and symbol followed by the lost and found text using a plane as well as random effector, and then add a camera to our scene with a little bit of tilt movement. Let's get started. So I'm currently looking at the text that we created and designed in the last movie. Now, the first thing that we want to do before animating the and symbol is add a camera to our scene. We can head here to the camera menu and add a camera. And unlike After Effects, we aren't looking through the actual camera that we just added. For that, we need to head to the Object Manager and click on this little icon in order to look through it. I'm going to deactivate the camera for a second and use my 3 key along with my 2 key and 1 key to move around the scene so we can see the camera, and then click back on to see that it still maintains the framing of what we saw in the active camera view. Now it's time to animate the and symbol. Now before we begin, I'm going to select the and extrude generator and notice that its axis, or what you might call its anchor point, is not in the center. Let's enable the access mode here on our toolbar. I'm going to drag down towards the and symbol, centering it on the and symbol, and I'll click to deactivate on the axis mode. Just to make sure that everything is looking good, I'm going to drag the P rotation to see that it is rotating around the center of the and text. And I'll press Command Z to undo my changes. Now, we want this text to be in its final resting position at the 160 frame mark. So I'll move there on the timeline. And next to the position values in the coordinate tab of the Attributes Manager, I'm going to click and drag quickly to add a keyframe to all of those properties. I'll do the same thing to each of the rotation values, and a keyframe is added, locking all of those values into place. Let's move our time indicator to the beginning of the timeline and enter the following values. So for the H rotation, enter 450. For the P rotation, enter 350. And enter 65 for the B rotation. Click and drag across those keyframes in order to activate them. And let's just press the play button in order to play back that rotation animation. All right, so we can see there that there's some built-in easing on that. I'm going to move back to the beginning of the timeline. And with the Z position, we can position our and symbol off camera. But to see this even better, let's look outside of the camera and inside our active perspective view, we can frame up ideally where we want this and symbol to be. So I want it to start off camera, lower in the scene, just above the camera in the scene. And it's worth checking this from multiple perspectives just to make sure that you line up the and symbol appropriately. Once we're happy at the 0 frame mark, click and drag to add a keyframe. And let's look back into our camera, go into that view, and take a look at the animation so far. Excellent. So if we want to tweak this animation, we can change our standard layout to the animate layout. And we can see our and extrude object right down here in the dope sheet. Now, sometimes, depending on the object that you have selected in the Object Manager, you might not see that object be displayed in the animate layout. In that case, all you have to do is drag whatever object you want to see in your dope sheet to reveal its keyframes and/or properties. One button that I really like is to frame the current animation that's selected into the graph view. You can do that by clicking on the frame selected or pressing the shortcut S. And here we have both sets of keyframes now framed into view. And let's twirl underneath the and object and go into our position values where we can now see the X, Y, and Z position. It's the Z position that was keyframed in this example. Options we have for keyframes involve looking at it with a graph. And in fact, if I twirl down this little arrow next to position, we can see here that we do have some easing on our position Z keyframe. I'm going to drag on the handle here just to add some more easing. And I'll see an update right there inside my viewport. I'm actually changing its path of motion. I'm going to just press the space bar in order to play back, noting that that is a little bit too high off screen. And I'll come down here and adjust this accordingly to change that motion path of the and symbol. I'm going to pause to stop, and I'll now just right click this keyframe to show that you can choose from a series of spline types. So we'll leave that there for the and animations path for the time being. And let's twirl up the position values and click the plus symbol to twirl down the rotation values. You have the option of soloing an animation. So I'm going to pause playback and move to the 160 frame mark in the timeline. And I'm going to click on this circle to isolate the P rotation value. And if I press the spacebar now, what this does in the viewport is only allows you to see the animation associated with that P rotation, allowing us to focus and make changes that are required to our animation. I'm going to twirl down the P value, select it here, and just add a little bit more easing here in the graph. Excellent. I'll click the S button again to unsolo that view and see the overall animation of the and symbol. I'll twirl up the rotation properties and head back to my layout where we'll look at this through the standard view. Now let's focus on the lost found text followed by our camera movement. I'll select the lost found extruded objects, and we're going to throw this into a fracture object ahead of time so that we can animate these letters separately. As in, if we keyframe the position and rotation values of the lost found extruded object, it will keyframe all of the letters together, and we want to have some character by character animation of our text coming in. So with that lost found extruded object selected, we'll head to the MoGraph menu, and let's press the Alt Option key and select the fracture object. We can see here that the lost and found extrude object becomes a child of the fracture. And with the fracture selected, we'll go to the Object tab and under Mode, change this from Straight to Explode, Segments, and Connect. With this extrude object in the fracture and the fracture still selected, head back to the MoGraph menu and let's add our first effector, which is the plane effector. Automatically, you'll see a change happening, and I'm just going to turn off the and symbol so that we can focus on that and press the pause key. What's happened is the lost and found text has been shifted in Y space. Under the plane effector in the attributes manager, let's head over to the parameter tab and notice that under the Y position, it's been moved up 100 centimeters. We don't want that in this case. Let's actually set this to 0. What we're going to do is animate the Z value of position so that this text altogether starts off screen. Rather than animate the Z position value under the parameter tab, we'll head to the effector tab and animate the strength, moving from the value set in the parameter tab to the value set directly on the lost found object extrude from before then. Let's zero this out for the time being, and we'll come back to the plane effector. Let's now focus on the random rotation of the individual characters of lost and found first. So I'll select the fracture object again, head back to my MoGraph menu, and under effector, let's add the random effector. Again, a change happens automatically, just like that plane effector. And if we look in the parameter tab, the position values of our text have been affected. Let's deselect this and click on rotation to focus on the H, P, and B values. I'm going to select a random amount for the H rotation, as well as the P rotation, and then also for B. Once happy with the initial setup, we could go and turn back on position and add a little bit of randomness specifically on the y-axis. So zero out X and Z and increase Y to a value of 150. For this animation, we want it to start right after the and symbol has been on screen for about 10 frames. So this is about the 50-ish frame mark. I'll move my playhead to that position, head to the effector tab under the attributes manager, and add a keyframe for strength. And I'll move now to the 175 frame mark, where I'll drag the strength value all the way to 0 and click to add a keyframe. If I go to the beginning, we can see the animation now start at the 50 frame mark and come into its resting position. Let's add to this by now going back to the plane effector. I'll drag up the strength and at the 50 frame mark, keyframe the strength. Let's go to the parameter tab, and with the position value selected, scrub the Y to a negative Z value, and I'll also affect the Y position just to bring this down a little bit. And heading back to the effector tab, I'll move to the 175 frame mark in the timeline and drag the strength value all the way down to 0, click to add a keyframe. Rewind to go to the beginning of my project and press play to now see the lost and found text. Let's actually turn back on the and symbol. And this is looking pretty nice. I'll press pause, go to the beginning of the timeline, and let's select both the plane and random effector by clicking and then command clicking, and choose our animate layout. With both the random and plane effectors selected, I'll make sure to frame those selected animations and then twirl down both the random and plane strength value. And I'm going to click, first of all, to select the strength value of the random effector and take a look under here in the key property values. First of all, I'm going to right click that last keyframe, and under spline types, I'm going to choose ease in. I want you to notice that there's now a left time and a right time, not to mention a percent value of left and right. For the percent value of left and right, I'll move just before to the 140 frame mark here in the timeline, and to the right value, I'm going to add a new percent value of 70. Let's rewind the project, noting that I did this to the random effector, and notice the easing there towards the end. In fact, if we take a look at these characters, most of the random rotation and position values has taken place before these come to a resting stop. I'll select the last keyframe on the strength value, right click that keyframe, and under the spline types, just to choose to ease in again, and add a right value of approximately 70%. Let's go back to our standard layout and add a final camera move, which is going to force us to make some tweaks here to our lost and found text animation. We already have ultimately our final resting position here. Let me select the camera, which we're looking through. We'll go to the coordinates tab in the attributes manager and add keyframes to our X, Y, and Z position, followed by all of our rotation values. We want our camera animation to start at the 0 frame mark. Let's look outside of the camera into our perspective view so we can see the camera icon. We'll push this camera a little bit back in Z space at the 0 frame mark and a little bit up in the Y axis. Click just to record those keyframes. Let's also add a bit of P rotation so it starts looking down and then over time starts tilting up. I'll click to record a keyframe, preview that animation, and again we can make additional changes, changing to the animate layout and playing around with our keyframe curves. Let's look through the camera to see how everything has come together. And we do have a problem with our tilt up that our and symbol as well as the found text starts on screen. One great thing about using a plane and random effector and animating with the effector's strength value, I could head to the parameter section, and by simply just now dragging on the Z value and making a change, I don't need to record a new keyframe. Now, as for the and change, we do have to select the and extrude object. By heading to the coordinates tab, we can make our adjustments on the 0 frame mark of our text. Paying close attention to try not to fly this and symbol directly through the eye of the camera to have an undesired animation. And I'm also paying attention to the blue arrow at the top of the frame, I'll record keyframes and see that and symbols animation with our lost and found text. In the next movie, we're going to damage the text that flies close to the camera with the help of some sculpting tools inside of Cinema. In this movie, we're going to look at creating some damage across the characters of our text that fly close to the camera. That includes the and symbol, as well as the O, the U, and the N from the word found. In order to do this, let's start with the and symbol. I'm going to position my playhead around the 57 frame mark so we have a nice close view of this. Okay, let's start making a copy of the and object. So I'm going to command, click, and drag here in the object manager with that and extrude object selected. And then I'm going to option double click the traffic lights for the original and the text spline so that we're only looking at this duplicate copy. With this duplicate copy, I'm going to go to Display, Ground Shading. Let's hop outside of our camera, to which we'll take a better look at this text. And I'm going to make some changes to the spline's intermediate points by switching it to subdivided. I want to settle on an angle of 2 degrees and a maximum length of 2 centimeters. I'm then going to head to the and object. And under the object tab, we're going to increase the subdivision here. So let's set that to a value of 6. You can see the added lines here. Now I'm going to hop back into my camera. Let's press C to make it editable. We get a null object as well as the editable object inside of it. We don't need to have the material tag when we send this over to a new project, so I want you to delete this. And we're going to now copy the and.one polygon object. And I'm going to go to the File, New Project, and we're going to paste it. This is going to be lost in 3D space until we hit the Reset PSR button. Let's zoom in on the and object and go to the Display, Ground Shading Lines to take a look at the geometry. And now we're going to go into our sculpting layout with that selected. Before we subdivide this object even further, I want to click on the gear icon next to the subdivide option. And under smoothness, I want to set the value to 0 and press OK. I'm going to go and just turn off the display of ground line shading right now. Let's click subdivide again. And again, we'll actually just settle on a subdivision that's just shy or over 1 million. I will zoom in on the and symbol, and we're going to start to use these sculpting brushes that you see displayed here across the surface of the and symbol. So I'll select the Pull tool. Just to make sure we're on the same page, you can click this Reset button in the Settings tab of the Attributes Manager so that the size and pressure are reset. In order to carry over the brush's settings when you make a change, you can link your size and pressure, meaning it will carry on over from the pull brush onto the next brush that you select. In order to change the size of my brush, I'm going to press the left square bracket. Keep in mind you can use your middle mouse tool to change the size and pressure as well if that's available to you. With these default settings, I'll start to paint across the surface of my text, and you can see here that I'm pulling on the geometry. I'll rotate around this so you can see how much it's actually pulled this by. A little bit too much, so I'll press Command Z, then bring down the pressure and draw again. I'll go to another area of this and symbol, this area here, and hold down the Command key while I brush to notice that I'm no longer pulling but pushing. So that Command key or Control key is going to reverse the operation of your brush. Using that pull tool a little bit further, I'll make a few more adjustments here to the sides, as well as combine it with that push to rough out some damage there across this area that I know is going to fly close to the camera. I'm going to move over onto the wax tool, which is also really interesting for creating damage, and make my brush extremely small in this case with the left square bracket, almost the size of 2. And with its current pressure, I'm going to change the brush draw mode from freehand, which we've been using, to line. And if I click, I'll draw out a line. And once I double click, it then creates some wax across the surface of my text, but in a straight fashion. I'll do this again, and then hop back into my freehand tool and then just rough out a little bit of wax here around the edges as well, and here on the front too. Moving over to the knife tool, I'll keep that size to be really small and actually choose that line tool again. And you can see how this is carving, in this case, into the surface of your character. And if I hold down the Command key, while using the line tool, it's going to reverse that operation. At any time when using one of the sculpting tools, you can load a brush preset. I'll select in this instance the Cracks 9 to notice that we've been brought up to our pull brush. And you need to keep in mind that you have to have the content browser installed on your system, which you can access from the help menu in order to have access to these presets. Here, I'm going to bring down the pressure, and then using the settings here with the draw mode set to draw a rectangle, draw a couple cracks across the surface of my end symbol. I'll do that up here as well, and then even hold down Command in certain instances. I'll choose another brush preset by loading it. I'll choose the Creators Want It in this instance, and we can see the entire pattern visible in the viewport. To change this, I'll head to the Stencil tab and click off the visible checkbox, decrease the size of my brush, head back to the Settings tab, and now decrease the pressure here to draw some craters across the surface of my text, which I'm pulling against. And then heading back up here to the top, holding down the Command key and doing the same thing with those craters. So take a few more moments to explore some more of these tools, such as Pinch, where you head over and can actually pinch your geometry, or do the exact opposite. And I'll join you in a second where I've damaged my text a little bit further, to which we'll then send it back to our original project. So here are the results of me playing around with the various sculpting brushes since we last left off. A couple other things to note. One is if you do decide to use one of those brush presets that comes with the additional content browser, if you ever need to turn it off and just get back to the regular pool tool, head to the Stencil tab, and if you turn off Use Stencil, you'll then be able to just use that regular pull tool. Another thing to keep in mind is I find myself constantly going to the Smooth tool to back off on some of the damage that I created there on my geometry. Let's actually go out of our sculpting layout and head back to our standard layout. You'll see here on our object there is a sculpting tag. If we go to the Attributes Manager, we can freeze these results. After we've done that, let's press Command-C. I'll head back to the window menu where my project is just there in the background, and then just press Control-V or Command-V to paste it inside. We're going to now select it and place it into the and.1 null. And now we're going to click on this Reset PSR button. The reason that we're placing the and symbol into the null is because it contains the animation that we set up in an earlier movie. You should see that it's in the relative same position coordinates as your original and symbol. In fact, so that they're not overlapping, I'm going to Option double click the traffic lights for that so we can just see the and let's render out the damage. Take a final view here. Excellent. Let's now just move forward in the project just to see how everything is lining up. That looks great. Now let's handle the OU and N from found. So I'm just going to twirl up these groups and let's open up the fracture lost and found. And we're going to make a copy of the extrude lost found text. So I'm just going to grab it, Command, click and drag just to make a copy of it. To make sure that we're looking at it by itself, I'm going to Option double click the traffic lights for the fracture. Now with the text copy, what we want to do is take the text spline and press C to make it editable. And then we get all of our lost found text as splines. We want to drag out the lost splines from the one group and make it a child of the extrude lost found. And do the same thing with the found text. Making it a child of the extrude and get rid of all of these groups. Now only the L is extruded right now, and that's because under the extrude object we have to check hierarchical, and now everything becomes extruded. Now with this setup, our next step is to select this extrude and press C. It's going to place it into a group, and inside that group are each of our letters contained inside of an extrude object. Now you can select an individual letter, press Command C, head to a new project, and then we press Command V. We can take the copied O and we can reset its PSR. And now we just have to make that editable. This is now good to bring to the sculpting layout and then subdividing this object. So I want you to go through and make some changes to the O, the U, and the N by individually making some sculpting damage on those characters. Now, once you're done making changes to your sculpt, you have to head back to your start up layout. Don't forget to freeze your sculpting results. And you can take your letter, such as this, I'm going to Command C it, and bring it back into the previous project that we were working with. So here's all my extruded splines, and I'm just going to press Command V to paste this right now. And I'm going to drag it so it's in the same group as my original O. And of course, reset, and then if I'm happy with the damage, get rid of that other spline. Now, in copying it this way, keep in mind the lost and found text are not animated, but we could easily take this group or null, place it back into the fracture object. I'm going to get or remove the original lost and found text and now turn back on the fracture. And you'll see there that your text is rotating by the random effector and also affected by the plane effector. So have fun making some damage to the O, the U, and the N, and I'll see you in the next movie where we're going to add in this movie, we're going to build a basic landscape background, followed by creating a depth pass with the use of our camera that we can then use inside of After Effects to further build our composite by changing our text as well as the landscape to recede further back into the background. Now, since we last left off, we were using sculpting tools, and you continued your exploration on the O, the U, and the N in terms of adding damage to them since they fly close to the camera. Now, you may also be wondering where the compass came from, and I actually grabbed this compass from TurboSquid for a small fee. However, you should note that there are other compasses on TurboSquid, as well as Sketchfab that I found, that are free. If we're going to go back to this specific antique compass, I got rid of the actual lid of the compass before animating the position of the compass to replace the O in my lost and found text. Let's start off by creating that landscape object. In order to do this, we'll create a new project, and using our primitive objects, we'll select the landscape object. I'm going to move so that we can face this dead on. We'll make the size 1000 in terms of its X value, 150 in terms of its Y, and 1000 in terms of its Z. We'll give it slightly more segments, 200, 200. Since this first row of landscapes will be close to the text, we'll have it also closer to sea level at a value of about 50% to start. I'll bring down the fine furrows to a value of 15% and increase the rough furrows to a value of 57%. Now, using this as an anchor for the rest of the first row, I'll zoom out a little bit. I'm going to make 2 copies of this. So I'll make 1 copy, place it to the right, also paying attention to the overlap between the 2 landscapes. And on the second landscape, I'm going to start to add a little bit of variation. So that could be to the rough furrows, adding a little bit more to the fine furrows, and then even playing with the scale of the landscape. I'll do that one more time, replicating that and bringing this over here to the side, and then changing up some of those previous values. Now that I have a first row of landscapes, I'm going to throw these into a null object. Now, one way to do that is I actually have the ability to add a null object docked here at the side of my interface. And how I did that is bringing up the commander with the key Shift-C. I typed in the word null and then just simply brought this up here to make it easily accessible. As we continue with this project, we'll be creating quite a few nulls. So adding a null to the scene, I'll select all 3 landscapes and then just call this first row in order to keep track of them. Let's press the Command or Control key while selecting the original landscape to make a copy of it for the second row. Let's look at these landscapes here from the side by rotating around our scene and zooming out. And with that copy, I'll position it back and then start to make this one quite a lot larger. I'll set this up to be just over double at 2500, moving it here over to the side. And then start to play with the sea level, bringing that down to a value of 30%, bringing up how large the mountains are, and then playing with the rough furrows, the scale of this object, and the fine furrows. I'll swing back around so we can get a general overview of these landscapes, and then make yet another copy of this one on the second row, start to differentiate some of these values. So copy that again, and then I'll create a null, place these into that new null group, calling this second row. I'm going to repeat that one more time to add a third row and then join you here in a second where we can copy this back over to our main project. So now the third row is complete, which I threw into a null group. I'm actually going to now create yet another null, call this mountains, and then place all of these rows inside. We're now ready to take this object, and of course we can make some changes in terms of this position. If some of these landscapes have too much overlap being seen between the various objects, but let's grab this, copy this, and then bring this into our main mountain build. I'm going to make sure that I'm at the last frame of the project, and let's press Command V in order to paste it. Depending on how your coordinates are set up or how you're looking at your text, I need to actually take my mountain background and bring this down quite a bit. And I want to position it behind the text. I don't want it to be in the same plane. So I'm going to look outside of the camera that I originally set up and then just use this to position the mountains back. I'll also look through multiple camera views just to see how this is set up in the top view, as well as the other orthographic views. I'll head back to the perspective view and then look through my main camera again. And this is a pretty good place to start. Now that this is set up, it's now time to create our depth pass. So we're actually going to select our camera and we're going to hop outside. In the Attributes Manager, let's head to the Details tab. And we're going to focus on creating a blurry range just in front of the camera and an in focus range when the text lines up here at this spot. So the first thing we'll do is enable that front blur. And you should see that once we did, a box was created, this little square box that you see over here. Now the map front blur's start value is actually determined by this front box or bigger box right here. With this dot here in the front, try to align it there so that it's right here with the text. Now in terms of the out of focus range, I'm going to drag this back and I want you to see that the map front blur end value is changing. So inside a depth pass, what's in focus is represented by black and what's out of focus is represented by white. Anything in between will be gray values. And we're going to keep this in mind when we render out a still frame from this project. So there is our map front blur. Let's continue by creating a map rear blur. We can see that our camera now has an additional control which represents when the map rear blur ends. And I actually want this to start getting really blurry when it hits that middle frame of the second row of mountains. In terms of the rear blur's start, we want to take in consideration the start value of our front blur, which is 0 centimeters, and have it start, slightly after where we've positioned it, which is right in the range of our text. So let's set that maybe to a value of about 350 and press OK. Let's actually look back into the eyes of the camera. We're going to head over to our Cinema 4D render settings. And before anything else, we want to enable a multipass. With multipass enabled, we're going to enable a depth pass. Now that we have this enabled, we can preview our in focus and out of focus areas represented by that black, gray, and white map. Under the output settings, it's set to your current frame so that we're just rendering out one frame within our project. And with that, we can actually render this to the picture viewer. So render this to the picture viewer, and by default, you're actually going to see the full rendered image of your project. What we're interested in is going to the Layer tab here in the picture viewer, clicking on the word Single Pass, and just viewing the depth pass. And here you can see our text is black, which represents something fully in focus, not to mention our first mountain range. As the mountains go back, they become a lighter and lighter gray until they're eventually white and fully out of focus, which is exactly what we want. Now, in order to just double check this, I'm going to close this down and move earlier in the project where we can kind of see some of our text where it's closer to the camera in multiple ranges here. I'll render out to the picture viewer one more time. And now that this image is rendered, we can see that the compass has that gray value. So it's slowly becoming more a darker gray and eventually will become black when it lands into its spot, meaning that it's in focus. But we can't see any of the actual text close to the camera, meaning that it's completely out of focus based on the fact that it is white. Now that this has successfully set up our depth pass, we are now going to focus in the next movie all about our render settings and actually sending out our text as well as our mountains as separate image sequence files that we can then use inside of. In this movie, we're going to prepare our project to export for After Effects by sending our text and mountain separately. Now, in order to do this, we could essentially add each of these groups to an object buffer. The problem lies in the fact that the text itself will still make a cut out of the mountains, and we want two complete independent objects along with our depth pass for both the mountain and the text. Now you should be aware that Cinema 4D has a system to handle multiple scene versions within the same project, which is called the take system. And there's some dedicated tutorials on Cineversity about this topic. In this video, we're going to show the manual way of doing it, and understanding that will allow you to understand takes better and why it might be advantageous to use. And this would be better served by rendering out the text by turning off the mountains temporarily, and then rendering out the mountains by turning off the text temporarily. So let's do just that. We'll start with our text and our shape. And I'm just going to turn off the mountains temporarily by Option double-clicking the traffic lights for the mountains. Let's head to the render settings, to our output section, and we want to choose a preset under the film and video category. We're going to set this to HDTV 1080-2997, and we want to make sure that we're going to be rendering out all frames of our existing project. Let's go to the Save section, and I'm going to click these three dots to target a new location on the desktop. I'll create a new folder, which I'm going to call Lost and Found Rend. I'll create that and choose Save. I actually have a token here, and I created this token, which is going to be the name of my files inside of Cinema 4D. So one of the flexibilities that we have is that we can either create folders or file names inside our save paths by navigating there, or directly inside this file window that you see in the render settings dialog box. You can find out more information about tokens on Cineversity, but this $.prj takes the name of the project and will basically name each of the images that we're about to create based on this, which is exactly what we want. So before this, I want to create another folder, which I'm going to call PNGs, and then it will be based on the name of the project. Now, the format of file that we're going to use is a PNG file. We want it to be 16 bits per channel, and we want to include an alpha channel, and we also want to save a multipass image. By saving a multipass image, we'll be able to save our depth pass and that black and white information that's required so that we can add a camera blur. I'll just take this existing file path on our regular image, copy that by Command C or Control C, followed by Command V. And here we have the same thing, lost and found renders. And instead of PNGs, I'm going to change this to depth so that all of these files are going to go into a folder called depth and be named based on the name of the project. Lastly, we want to include a compositing project file, which we're going to save and to the target application of After Effects, and make sure to include 3D data, which will have all of our camera information. This is going to be great when we add some particles from Trapcode Particular, part of Maxon One, to our scene, and it will pick up all of the camera movement. So this is all set up for our first export. Let's now render everything to the picture viewer. So I will click on the render to picture viewer, and you'll notice that it slowly starts to export out each of the frames. Now keep in mind the text is not seen for the first few frames. And now we can see the compass coming into view, as well as if I head to the layer tab and click on single pass under layer, we can see the depth pass that is currently being generated for our text. Now for the text and the depth pass with the newly added compass on my system, this took just over 15 minutes for the final render. So we can see the main folder here on my desktop, the lost and found rend. Here is the depth folder, and you can start to see how that depth path changes over time. And here are the PNG files associated with the text. The alpha channel sent out is included in these PNG files. If we were to do a JPEG image sequence, the alpha channel would actually be in a separate folder that we would have to reference inside of After Effects through the use of a track mat. So I'll head back to Cinema 4D and let's option double click the traffic lights for the mountains. And I'm going to option double click the traffic lights for the text shape. So now all we're seeing are the mountain files. Let's head into our render settings. The output is great. Let's head to the save section and make one small change to differentiate our PNG and our depth pass files for the mountains. So next to PNG, I'm just going to make a space and put mountains. And I'm just going to do that for the depth pass as well. So mountains, just so that we have separate folders for them, but they're still in that lost and found rend folder. Now, as for the compositing project file, we don't need to save it again because we already have a copy of the AEC file with our text. Great. So now that these options are set, the output is good. We've got our regular image and also our depth pass going out in that PNG format. I'm going to close this and then let Cinema 4D do its work by rendering to the picture viewer. Here's our picture viewer. We can already see our mountains. We could also go to the layer tab and take a look at the depth pass by clicking on single pass. However, the mountains are so close to the camera right now that everything would appear to be white. So I'm back here in my lost and found rend folder where I have my depth mountains and my PNG mountains all complete. And this took just over 10 minutes. In fact, if I just go into list view of my PNG files, you can see the first lost and found PNG was created at 8:14. This last one here we can see was created at 8:25. So that's around 11 minutes. And if we look at the depth mountains, where we can kind of see the first frame, we created at the same time. And we go here to the last frame where we'll see a better indication of our depth pass. We can see that that's also at 8:25. So now it's time to take all of this in along with our AEC file, which was created in the original PNGs folder, into After Effects. And for that, I'll join you in the next movie. In this movie, we're going to bring in our files from Cinema 4D into After Effects to begin the compositing journey. And we're going to focus on the background in this movie. So in a blank After Effects project and in the project panel, let's double click in a blank area in order to navigate on our system to where our files are saved. I'm going to head to the PNGs folder where the AEC file that contains my text as well as the depth pass for my text will all be brought in together if I just select this. So just a quick note, in order to get After Effects to read AEC files, you need to install the Cinema 4D importer.plugin from Cinema 4D's Exchange plugins folder. Once that's installed in the correct location, you'll be able to see these AEC files. So once you press open, notice two folders. One folder containing the After Effects composition that also contains the text file with the alpha channel, and then a special passes which contains our depth pass for the text. If I double click the composition, you'll see that I get the Cinema 4D camera and lights reference because we clicked that 3D data button. And I'm just going to come down to the end of my composition and move the end of my work area and click the gray work area bar to trim that work area so that my composition is the exact length I need it to be. Now let's double click also to bring in the assets of our mountains. So in the PNG mountains folder, in our lost and rend folder, let's select the first PNG file and under import as, make sure PNG sequence is selected. Once we choose open, here's those mountains. Let me rename that appropriately to differentiate it from the text. And actually, while I'm at it, just differentiate this by calling that text. I'll drag that mountains into the folder with the composition and the text, and then just place the mountains underneath the text. And you can see there, they're all part of one composition. We still need the depth pass for our mountains, so I'm going to double click, go into the lost and rend folder, into the depth mountains folder, select that first PNG file, making sure PNG sequence is turned on, and I'll press open. We'll drag this into the special passes folder. I'm going to name this depth mountains, and then the first one, depth text. This will come in handy when we start to reference these image sequences. So first thing first, with my mountains in the composition now, I'm going to select it and create a pre-composition. So I'll go to the layer menu, choose pre-compose, make sure move all attributes into the new composition is selected, and I'll call this mountains. And I'm going to double click that composition to open it, and then place that depth mountains pass above the original mountains PNG image. I'd like to blend these two together to create a stylistic look. And after some experimentation, I'm going to head to the blend mode categories and choose lighten. For any reason that you don't see these modes or track matte, just toggle your switches and modes at the bottom left of your composition. So here's the result of lighten. And I'm actually going to select the depth mountains, and we could also play around with the opacity by pressing the T key if we did want to see a bit more of those mountains in the background by just bringing down its opacity slightly. So I brought it down to 96. I'm just going to toggle my transparency grid on so you can see that the background here isn't solid. And if we want it to be solid, we could always add a layer, new, solid to our composition. We'll call it solid white BG, and we'll place it underneath the mountains. I'm going to go back to my lost and found build mountains newest composition that contains both the text and the mountains. And let's add a stylistic effects to the mountains using Red Giant Universe. To do that, I'm going to go to my window menu and under extensions, choose the Red Giant Universe dashboard. I'd have already docked it to the right of the composition. And now I'm taking a look at the generators category. Now you may be thinking, well, I could add just a regular After Effects ramp to this, and you certainly can. I will say that the gradient ramp and the soft gradient background contain more than just a gradient. They contain fractal noise and even a few textures. So it also has a visual guide in terms of different presets when you use the dashboard. If I select the gradient ramp, you can see here a few different presets. I like this blue spotlight look, so I'm going to apply that preset to the mountains. It completely wipes it out, which is not necessarily what I'm looking for, but the magic of this is that we can blend it into the layer that we place it on. With the blend mode property, I'm going to choose multiply to mix in those mountains again. I'm finding this a little too dark, so I'm going to go to the end color stop that's here and select a bluish color, but just doing that brings up that color, and so it's not so dark. So that's the before, and that's the after. I'll actually back down on that a bit. As a final step for our background, we're going to blur it a little bit. And for that, we're going to add a camera lens blur effect, which is native in After Effects. So effects and presets. I'll type in camera. Under the blur and sharpen category, I'm going to add that to the mountain. Basically, it's already added a blur, but what's even better is that we can actually have this camera lens blur reference a blur map. And we just so happen to have our depth mountains special pass. I'm going to bring it into this composition, but turn it off this time. With my mountain selected, going back to effect controls, I'll reference that depth mountains layer. It's going to use that as a source, looking at its luminance. To see this a bit better, I'm going to increase the blur quite a bit more. And to make sure that it continues on the edges, I'll repeat the edge pixels in this case. But if I toggle on and off the blur map, notice how it's focused there on the background. Obviously, 80 in terms of a blur radius is way too much. I'm going to settle on a value of 8 for now, and we can come back to this to customize this. But in this movie, we brought in that AEC file containing our text as well as our 3D data from Cinema 4D. We then brought in our background mountains and we stylized them by bringing in the depth pass into a pre-comp, and then referenced that same depth pass using our camera lens blur effect here inside. In this movie, we're going to focus on the text in After Effects. We're going to add the depth pass to it, as well as give this text a little bit of a glow. So let's hop inside our project panel, and we have our depth text right here. We're going to bring that just above our text, and you can see what it looks like. And what I'd like to do is actually add a little bit of blur to this depth. Let's add that fast box blur to our depth text. It hasn't gotten blurry just yet because we have to increase the blur radius. And let's settle on a small amount of 5 and make sure we repeat the edge pixels. We can now take this depth text layer and turn it off. And on our text layer, let's go inside our effects and presets and find that camera lens blur, apply it to the text, and like we did in the last movie, rather than have the entire text blurry, we will reference that depth text layer. Now keep in mind, doing this isn't enough. We want to reference that layer as well as the effects and masks that are on it so that it sees that it's blurred. And we should see now, primarily in the foreground, that our compass is blurry at a radius of about 5 right now, but as it goes into the background, it eventually becomes in focus. Same with the rest of our text. In taking a look at this, I want to take that blur radius and bring this down quite a bit. We could always go to the depth text as well, go back to the box blur, and lower the blur radius so that it's not as big. To add another element to our text, we can actually add an effect called optical glow. I'm going to go to effects and presets and type in the word optical. Under RGB effects, grab this optical glow, and it's making my text glow quite a bit, and it's a much more realistic fall off of glow than that of the native After Effects glow. You might be wondering where your mountain went, and that is because the default alpha channel is set to none, and we want to set this to extend unmult. We're going to set this to a value of 1, and maybe we want this text to glow when it's closer to the camera. Let's change that to 3. We'll have it start at 3. I'll keyframe the amount, and let's go down to when it comes into its resting position, which is roughly around the 5-second mark, where we have no glow anymore at the end. So our text glows and then lands into place with no glow. As a final complement to our text animation, we're going to add some particles from Trapcode Particular in the next movie that will act as embers popping up. In this movie, we're going to create some particle embers which are going to exist behind our lost and found text and shoot up at specific times. So we want the first particle system to actually be born right after the compass comes into frame. The second particle embers come in when the O, U, and N enter the frame, giving a burst and having all particles end their life by 6 seconds when the lost and found text comes into place. To do this, we're going to use Trapcode Particular, and I'm going to create a new composition, which I'll call Particle Embers. I will create a new solid from the layer menu, to which I'll call Particular. And if you look over to my effects and presets, I've already done a search for the Trapcode Particular effect available with Maxon One, and I'll drop that on to the solid. By default, we'll get a particle system, which is emitting from a point in the middle of the screen. So there it is. So I'm going to stop playback. And to start this off initially, we're going to work inside the designer because it's going to be a lot quicker before we bring it inside of our composition, and it will be slowed down because of all of the layers that are inside. I'm going to stop playback here inside the designer, and we're going to work with these blocks. These blocks somewhat mimic the various categories that you saw in the effect controls of After Effects. However, it's much easier to find properties as there are a lot less in each of these individual blocks. If I head to the emitter type, we're going to change this to a sphere. We're going to decrease the emitter size to be 300. Now, rather than have particles emit all over the place, 360 degrees around, we're going to go to the Motion tab. And here we're going to choose Directional. Let's change the X rotation to 90 degrees and actually increase the direction spread to that to be 30 so that they spread out a bit more. We'll go to the emitter type and also lower the position. Let's head to particle type and lower the lifespan of these particles to be really short, 1.2. And then the latest version of Trapcode Particular, under particle type, we can give our particles an actual mass. I'm going to set this to be really low, a value of 1, and have a mass randomness to these particles of 50%. I also want to make sure that the size of these particles affect the mass up to 100%. And for there to be a small amount of air resistance as these travel upward, make that a bit random as well. These particles aren't going very far, but if we head to the environment block under physics, we can get other forces to force these embers up. One of those being our wind Y. In fact, I'm just going to increase this to an amount of -400 to start. The other thing is I want these particles to be to the left of the text and actually floating to the right as well. So I'll add a wind X value so I can see them floating to the side. It's a bit too much, so let's settle on a value of 200. And rather than having them all travel along this sort of straight linear path, we're going to add some turbulence to their motion. And that is going to be under the air turbulence field, where I'll set this to be an initial value of 30. You can start to see that these particles are changing their original movement. I'm going to increase that even more to a value of 80. But rather than be that sporadic, I'll move this air turbulence with the wind values that I've set to 100%. Let's spin these as well. I'm going to settle on a scale value of 6. I'm going to head to the opacity block, and I want to make sure when these particles die, they actually fade out. They're completely opaque, and then they fade out over time by using this preset. Let's go to the size and make these particles a little bit smaller, a value of 3, and add a lot of randomness. In fact, we could even use a random graph where we get this flickering. However, if you smooth it out down here, adds for an interesting look of your embers, a little bit of a blinking effect. You can even combine this with the other graph by clicking on this pen tool. So let's make sure the size of these particles start off at full strength, kind of go through a random period in terms of size, and then just die at the end of their lifespan. Cool. Let's apply this. Let's take this particle layer we've created, the solid, copy it into our main project. And notice that when we copy it and move it underneath our text, it's nowhere really to be seen. And that is because Particular, while it can be affected by an After Effects camera, the camera that we are referencing happens to be from Cinema 4D. So the best thing to do to kind of get a hold of this system is to go to the position value and make these coordinates 0, 0, because that's the world center in Cinema 4D. I'm going to move the particles over to the left by scrubbing the X position. And I'm also going to move it down so that it starts off screen. I want to change where this particle system starts emitting from, which is going to be just after 1 second. You can see there that it starts having particles be born right when the compass enters the screen. However, we need to bring down its Y position even more. We don't want to see them just pop on. And there we have it. Those particles that drift upward in space. They're actually traveling, in my opinion, a little bit too far upward, and they're emitting for too long. Let's go to the particle system and actually add some keyframes where we have an initial particles per second at the beginning of 100. But around 2 seconds, let's choose to emit 0 particles per second. We should see a difference in this where we have an initial burst, then those particles die. We could also go to the position of the particle system, just play around with the Z value, but a negative position is going to move them closer and make them a little bit bigger. I'm going to come here to the emitter size and bring them closer together. I'm going to press U to reveal the keyframes on the particle system and then just go to the beginning where I'm going to have 200 particles be born initially with a burst. And then, as we can see, fade off. So we can go here inside our environment and then just lower this wind quite a bit. So a lot of the time we'll have an initial idea of what we see in the designer, but then tweak that up accordingly to match our animation. Now, before departing with our particles here and then creating our new system, let's actually head into the particle and give these some color. So I'm going to give this an orange color. And just so you can see the particles individually, I'll solo that layer. Here we can see them. And I'll increase the size temporarily so that we can see the color that we're currently giving them. I want to add a blend mode of add and close down the particle section where I'm going to go to the lighting category. It's here that I'm going to enable a shadowlet. And that shadowlet's going to be a white color that's going to be super close to these embers. So first off, let's bring up the shadowlet opacity, allow us to see these white points a bit better. And then let's adjust the distance, like something like 2. This white spot now is on each of these embers. The shadowlet opacity is a bit too much, so I'm going to set this to a value of 80. We can now duplicate this and then make additional changes to our other system, which we're going to have blow in the opposite direction and a little bit later. So here's what we have so far in terms of our initial system. I made these particles a bit bigger. I'm going to make them a value of 4 right now, but we have this nice little burst of our embers being affected by turbulent values inside of Trapcode Particular. In the next movie, we will create a second system, which we'll have emit later, and then make adjustments to that, followed by some final composite. In this movie, we're going to make a duplicate copy of our original particle system that you see here. And we're going to have it emit from the opposite wind direction on X. So I'm going to stop playback, and I'm going to take the original particle system, which I've now named Particular One, which I suggest that you do as well. We'll now press Command D or Control D to duplicate it. And I'm going to position my playhead roughly where the OUN text enters the screen. I'll turn off the original particle system. And I'm just going to scrub the second system so that it starts peeking out a bit once these enter the frame. So you can see here the OUN come in, and then there's that particle burst. Now obviously we don't want it to move in the exact same way of our first system. So I'm going to close out the particle section for a second and head into the environment section where we adjusted the wind in the last movie. Let's just place this in the negative direction. I'm going to make this negative 300. We'll see what happens. This is going to blow it quite ferociously over to the left. Obviously, its position isn't helping us, so let's head into the emitter category. We're going to scrub the x-axis so this moves across the screen. Essentially, we want the system to be about 390 in the x-axis, and there you can see that burst of particles. Let's see it in relation with our first particle system as well. So we have the first particle burst followed by a second with a slightly larger wind value. Cool. In the emitter category, you're going to increase the emitter size in this case to 300 so it has a wider span.
I'm going to press U to reveal its keyframes in the timeline. I'll move to the first keyframe, which is the initial particle burst. And I want that to be greater for the second system, 300ths. So we have a slightly greater particle burst coming over here from the right with more of an angle. I'll close down this emitter section. And in the environment section, increase the air density a bit to about a value of 3. And let's also increase the wind Y to be a bit larger, negative 180. And we can head into the particle where we can add a slight life randomness and a slightly longer lifespan, 1.4. So I like this initial burst, but we essentially want it to be cleared when our text is at the 6-second mark. So I want to take this keyframe and just drag it in and dial back on what I originally told you to do, which is the lifespan of these particles. Maybe let's settle on a value of 0.6. So the burst is even less. Now if I wanted them to rise in the sky, we're just going to go back and now tweak the environment. So this is a huge push and pull process of just getting that physical reaction that you want from your particles. And while I'm here in the environment section, I also want to increase the turbulence a bit of this particle system to be about 95. So it's a bit more turbulent. Now that we've added our first burst and our second burst, it's now time to add just a few final compositing effects onto these items for finalization. And for that, I'll see you. We're going to make some final changes to our lost and found composite. We've got those 2 bursts of embers as well as our mountainous background. I want to just stop the playback and we're going to add a basic effect to both particle systems. So for this, we're going to rely on Universe. So we used this earlier. I'm actually going to go to the Window menu, Extensions, RG Universe Dashboard. In fact, I want to select the first particle system so we can see it. Head to the Distort section. I'm going to apply a heat wave effect. This is just going to allow for a little bit of distortion, and I'll apply the same default heat wave effect to the second particle system. One great thing is that heat wave from Universe, if you choose a preset, there's several to choose from, but the default one is pretty subdued compared to the others. Now that that's applied, I'm going to go to the Layer menu and apply a new adjustment layer. In Magic Bullet Suite, there is an effect called Renoiser. Now what's great about this is we can apply it onto an adjustment layer above our projects and choose a certain grain amount for the entire project. So just to see this clearly, I'm going to set an amount of 100. It applies this nice grain on top of all of our images to combine them together. Now I'm going to lower this because if you're exporting this to the web, you're going to want this to be an extremely small amount. And in fact, the default of 25 is a good place to start. Depending on the type of grain you want, you've got a few presets to choose from. I'll choose Cinema Holdout in this case. That's going to increase the grain amount. We'll just add a bit more sharpness and actually decrease that, ending up with a more subdued value. Excellent. Now that we've added that Renoiser effect, let's also head into the glow category, where there happens to be a general glow effect in Universe, which is the sister to optical glow, which we used earlier on our text. I'm just going to apply this effect to add an overall glow to my composite and lower the intensity quite a bit, so just a subtle glow over everything. I'll just turn that on so you can sort of see the before and after value. It just adds a little bit of glow to my text as well as my background to unify everything together. And here we've added 2 effects to the adjustment layer as well as those heat wave effects to our embers. I hope you enjoyed this series and check out some more topics on text directly on Cineversity to keep up your knowledge with Cinema 4D. I'm Nick Harras and I'll see you around Cineversity.